Welcome to Interstates. I'm Alex Chambers. So on our last episode, we talked about welcoming refugees into the U.S. And it got me thinking about what it's like to live away from the place you're from, especially if it's in another part of the world. Say your mother is Lebanese and, I don't know, your father's American but also grew up in Beirut. And their circumstances meant that you grew up in Cyprus and Pakistan and spent your later childhood and adolescence in Baltimore. And they taught you English rather than Arabic, so your mother's family's language lives in your brain, but in a kind of ethereal way, not one you can just converse in. How do you relate to your roots in Lebanon? To Arabic? Where's your home? What's your mother tongue? I imagine you too have been wondering about that scenario. And of course you started listening to this episode for the answers. So it saddens me to tell you that while those questions are at the heart of this episode, we can't just give you the answers. They're essay questions, not multiple choice. And they're too individual and complex, and really they keep shifting around as time goes by. Luckily, we do have ways of delving into them. And if you were thinking, oh, poetry's probably a good way, I don't blame you. It's the end of April, which, along with being the cruelest month, according to T.S. Eliot, is also National Poetry Month. Like everyone else, you've been thinking in poetry for the past 30 days. So, to keep that going, I went out and found a poet to help us think through the dynamics of that scenario. A scenario that is, coincidentally, quite similar to her own life, and which she explores in her first book of poems, which came out only 2 days ago on April 28th. The poet is Janan Alexandra. Her book is called Come From. It was published by Boa Editions, which is a great poetry press. And you can listen to our conversation and then check out the book yourself. All of that right after this. All right, let's review the scenario. And you know what? Let's just imagine Janan right into it. Her mom is Lebanese, her dad is American, but his parents were teaching in Beirut when he was born, and that's where he grew up. They left Beirut in the 80s in the wake of the Civil War. They fled to Yemen, and then they moved to Islamabad in Pakistan.
And part of the movement is because at the time my dad was working in humanitarian aid and relief work. So he had opportunities in different places, and we moved sort of under his wing. And then, let's see, in the late 90s, we moved to the U.S., to Baltimore. And that was supposed to be a temporary thing. There was a lot happening in my family and for my parents at the time. I don't think either of them wanted to come to the U.S., and certainly I know my mother didn't want to raise her children here, didn't want to raise us here. And so...
Do you have a sense of why not?
I think that culturally, the idea of living in the United States or raising kids in the United States felt frightening to my mom. Like the idea that, you know, first of all, the U.S. is like the belly of the beast. It's the seat of so much violence around the world and such a force of destruction, especially in the Arab world, but obviously not only. And so I think the idea of being in the United States was already, there was nothing appealing about that for my mom, given her worldview, her politics, probably for both my parents, really. And, you know, then there's all these other things, the fact that the U.S. is huge, and maybe thinking about what kinship networks look like here, what, you know, community looks like here. Like whenever I'm in a place like Lebanon or Cyprus, you know, people are like, what, you guys drive 1 hour to go to work every day? Or, you know, you don't have health care. Like there's so many basic things that are astonishing to people in other parts of the world where the U.S. is not this like exceptional dream. It's you know, it's actually, I think, something that a lot of folks really want to protect against. But I also think, I imagine, knowing my mother as I do, all sorts of other things. She's fluent in 3 languages perfectly. She has full, beautiful command over English, French, and Arabic, living in a country that is so monolingual. Not everywhere, right? But I think the dominant culture is one of monolingualism. Being an Arab in the U.S., where so much of the time the first question you're met with is, are you Muslim or are you Christian, which reflects a sort of like fundamental lack of understanding of Arab history and culture and the complexity and the sort of like great multitudes of religious backgrounds, practices, habits, communities, etc. Like there's not just this binary. They're like loaded behind that question is so much else, right? It's coded with all these other assumptions. Another really common first response that I've often heard from folks is like, oh, it must be so hard to be from that part of the world, or, oh, like there's always so much violence happening, right? Violence happening, this like passive construction,
that, in terms of where the violence is coming from, and
and again, there's a really glaring lack of appreciation for the vast history that predates the last 100 years, right? Mm-hmm. All the sort of like richness and beauty. That's not usually, that's maybe I shouldn't say not usually, but when you're met with some kind of assumption or comment that sort of like reproduces all these tropes and stereotypes, it reveals like a fundamental lack of understanding of so much more.
Those questions of home and displacement and grief for, a place that maybe you have roots in, but for whatever reason can't go back to, or maybe it just doesn't quite make sense to go back to in the same way. They were all through the book. And so I want to keep coming back to that. And this is not unconnected, but I was also curious to hear about language, because the relationship to Arabic is, especially in the parables section of the book, is really key. So can you talk about your relationship to languages, like what you grew up speaking and all that?
Yeah, so interestingly, and sort of devastatingly for me, I think, or I feel it as a kind of devastation, the language around the house spoken, when we were kids, and specifically like the language that my parents raised us in, is English. And Arabic was always, sort of in the periphery, but not in the sense that it, when we lived in Pakistan, for example, Arabic was not really in the periphery. Urdu was in the periphery. There was a really big international community because we went to an international school. I think English became the sort of like the channel of communication because of the places that we were in.
Because you were in so many different places that it made sense.
Yeah,
English was
it was
the
sort of
franca.
Exactly.
Right.
And my parents would speak Arabic with each other, particularly when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying. Or, if my mom was on the phone with a family member or a really dear friend in Beirut, she would speak in Arabic. But we didn't have, grandparents and aunties and uncles who were surrounding us all the time speaking Arabic. So English was sort of the dominant language. French was also, I would say, equally present in my ear growing up.
As English or as Arabic?
As Arabic.
As Arabic,
yeah,
okay.
French and Arabic were, and those are sort of my mom's two. It's hard to think of what her mother tongues are, but growing up in Lebanon at the time that she was born in 1956, and so when she was in school, French was, because of basically like linguistic erasure that the colonial project performs, French was the language expected of students at school. Mm-hmm. And Arabic was considered a language that you should forget or whatever. So my mom even, she's a translator. She translates Arabic literature from Arabic into English. But she will often say that our dad's Arabic is better than hers, or that he has like he has some sort of like essential understandings of the language that she has felt in her adult life that she doesn't even possess. So I think she also has these sort of like ruptures around language. But yeah, I mean, I think as is the case for so many diasporic communities, our mother tongues are with us on a really sort of like atomic cellular level. Like if I'm walking down the street and I hear somebody speaking Arabic, it is enough to bring me to tears or to make me feel a deep sense of kinship with them and to feel a sense of belonging. But that's physical. It's like in my nervous system, whereas I can't actually sustain a conversation with them in Arabic. There's not just on the level of vocabulary, there's also just, and this is part of what the parable sequence explores, there's a really tactile, physical relationship to language. You know, you have to develop the mouth shapes and the muscles and the throat movements, all the different things that languages require of us to articulate the sound, you know.
Can we actually go to a poem? Because I was wanting to talk about the title poem, because this is one of those poems that has so much of that, I think, sense of distance and yearning.
So this is Come From. If we do not speak in the night, in the kitchen, here leaning over the starry counter like two hunched sunflowers, if we do not stand stooped like this, picking at cold lasagna, which is neither the food of your country nor my own, how will we carry this tin pail sloshing with the question, can you imagine walking into a softly lit room in the world and feeling, here I am, home with all of you? To be known in the arithmetic of belonging, we follow an order of operations. We do the math, enough and not enough. What are you really, really? From? Really, we are the field in each other's eyes. We hope to die surrounded by our own languages, even those we cannot speak.
I feel like the speaker isn't... It's not necessarily that the speaker is just wanting to go back to a place. I feel like it's more this yearning for, I mean, those last lines, to die surrounded by our own languages, even those we cannot speak, isn't specifically about a place. And it's about wanting to reach back to those languages, I think, that feed or fed a person. But I think there's something, what am I trying to get at? There's something sort of almost impossible, I feel like, about that desire. Maybe because what's kind of implicit in there too is just simply that impossibility, the loss of those things, and the fact that we sometimes don't even speak those languages. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious how that helps us think about like what it means to be from a place, or what it means to kind of make home somewhere that you're not from.
Yeah. I think that the thing that the book has taught me most, or the project of these poems, has been divesting from the idea that there is a place to go back to, and divesting from the attachment to wholeness or the myth of wholeness, right? And instead centering that rupture, you know, and living with it and figuring out how to bear it. And part of that is kind of like doing away with any discourse of legibility. That to be from a place means different things to different people. We are each from so many different experiences, cultures, origins, influences. You know, when I'm in Lebanon, I'm often perceived as a white American, and if I'm talking to someone, they'll sort of want to know if I can speak Arabic, and that's the like that's how they know if I'm really Lebanese or not, you know?
Right.
And that's kind of a mind fuck, because it's like, I understand why language is so essential to our sense of, community, but also I can't explain myself. I am as I am because of many different huge and small histories.
And you have an internal sense of being Lebanese.
Yes, and being, really connected to Lebanon and thinking about part of the, hoping to die surrounded by our own languages is thinking about the kind of comfort and joy and beauty of particular expressions in Arabic, right? Thinking about my mother's voice saying something to me that she says every time I get out of the shower, because there's an expression that you say,
And what
or
is that?
it's naiman, which means it's sort of like you say it if someone gets a haircut, or somebody's just bathed or just done some kind of like pampering,
Cool.
Or if we're sitting down to eat at the table, you say sahtain. Those things live in me.
Yeah.
And so I think the poems are in some ways interested in refusing legibility and saying, I know it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up to one linear thing. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it makes me curious if you kind of said this already, but I'd like to hear a little bit more if that was a change in your own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, was there maybe when you were a younger adult, this sense that, I could like kind of reach this sense of home somehow, or like get back to something, or even if not necessarily intellectually, you probably knew on some level that wasn't possible. But it sounds like in writing this, your kind of relationship to that changed. And I wonder if you can articulate a little bit more what it was before this book.
Mm-hmm. I think that it has changed, and a lot of that is also the influence of my friends and my teachers and the people I read. And I think maybe before I was still somewhat susceptible to the myth of wholeness, right? Mm-hmm. Or the sort of myth of like, I am one thing, I want to be perceived this way, I want to be perceived correctly. I have so many little anecdotes that can accompany that. But I think that ultimately that is a project of nations and nation states, and I'm not interested in that project. I'm not interested in deciding who's in and who's out and who's Lebanese and who's not Lebanese and, or whatever, insert any identity category. Yeah. Anything you're attached to, I think that my own sort of research interests and devotion to plurality and to the patchwork, the tatter, the quilt, right, as a kind of metaphor for how we experience our aliveness, or at least how I do, feels really important. So I don't think there wasn't like an epiphany moment.
Sure.
I think that slowly the lessons kind of unfolded. And I think there's so much, part of it is also like grieving and being accountable to your own sadness about what is lost and what has been ruptured, or what isn't possible, or what you wish could be different. And instead of trying to change it, really making space for it, making space for that kind of fragmentation.
I think that's so true. I feel like that's a big part of being an adult, is kind of accepting the ways that you maybe don't have as much control as you had imagined, and you can't. If there were things that you had imagined might be the case, or that you could maybe make happen, and then sort of realizing that there are limits, and that we just have to grieve some things. And like you said, sort of sitting with that and being accountable to that grief or sadness rather than trying to change it somehow or imagine that you could change it, I think we have to go through that to become another sort of level of maturity or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's grown.
Yeah.
That's some grown shit,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I think
Totally.
Yeah, I think I do think that for a long time, like as a teenager and probably as a young adult, I did not see myself staying in the US. I think I did imagine that like the other side of the story, the other shoe would drop and we would, we would not go back, return in any sort of linear way, but that the U.S. being in America felt like something I really rejected.
Yeah.
And so do my family members in different ways. And I think that maybe part of what you're talking about, the maturing or the growth, is recognizing also that, I have lived deeply here and I have really, really powerful connections to people and place here. And my life has mostly unfolded here. And yeah, I think coming to terms with that is also important.
And like seeing this place as more complex also, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I thought of earlier is, thinking about how much community I have with other people who have these really complicated families and histories and whose countries have been carved up and, annihilated by the U.S. or other imperial powers, who have really mystical, spiritual relationships with parts of their heritage language or their heritage places, but who don't, who can't squarely check a box. And I think, remembering that the abundance of those stories as well is important.
But there are so many people who've had to deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, that's the history of most people in the world, right. I think, in this era, and maybe beyond.
Maybe beyond, yeah. But certainly this era.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll wrap up by talking about witnessing disasters from afar and the challenge of translating what we feel in our bodies into sentences, which is part of what poetry is about. Stay with us. So the last poem in the book is Arab American Syntax.
Mm-hmm.
It opens with a speaker in the U.S. on August 4th, 2020, which was the day of the horrible explosion in Beirut.
Yeah, and I'll just say, to add on to that, when the hangar blew at the port, I was in Portland, Maine, visiting a friend, and in contact with lots and lots of beloveds, either in Beirut or not in Beirut, but, deeply
but also
concerned.
connected.
Yeah. And so one of the projects of this piece, I think, is also the question of how do we bear catastrophe at a distance? What is it like to be a witness to catastrophe or disaster, but also fundamentally your body is intact and you are safe? I think that's a really big part of my experience in diaspora. So that's a little bit what this piece explores.
Yeah, and it's so much a question, I think, of our time in a broader sense, too.
Mm-hmm. So this is toward the end of the piece. I realize I've avoided calling myself Lebanese because of a problem with syntax. So much is left out of the sentence, however I arrange the words. People raise their eyebrows, ask for proof. If I was born, grew up, have family there, if I'm Muslim, if I speak Lebanese, if where you are from corresponds to where you were born, Here are my sentences. I was born in Nicosia, Cyprus, on May 18th, 1990. I remember the smell of tahinopita and a pair of long fluorescent lights on the kitchen ceiling. What I know is the feeling of things. When I say Cyprus, it feels like terracotta pots filled with sesame and honey, a tongue rolled up like the spire of a snail, wind trilling through each whirl, weight of warm bread in my hand. My lips make a pretty shape for Nicosia. I nearly sing the word, a string of minor notes, 4 syllables that twinkle blue in my ear, kingdom of warbling sea. For years I carried an eraser that was shaped like Cyprus with a map of the island printed on its surface in primary colors, probably a trinket from a gift shop. I loved to hold it in my hand like a soft hook, touching and smelling the sharp, sweet rubber on my fingers. I lost the eraser somewhere along the way to America. Is where you come from what you have lost along the way?
I love that eraser.
Me too. Funny story that kind of like takes the stakes down. Of the eraser and that immense loss.
Right.
I
in the poem.
spent a year in Cyprus from 2021 to 2022, and it was my first time returning there as an adult. And I found that exact little eraser at one of the sort of like touristy stalls along this like main shopping street. So I, in fact, have refound the eraser.
Right.
It's not the same one, but,
have unlost the eraser.
Yeah, I have unlost it.
so maybe you
all is well.
can no longer be from that place if where you're from is what
Yeah.
you've lost along the way.
Yeah.
I'm glad all is well and that's been tied up and everything is settled.
Yeah, I mean, just reading that piece, too, I think so much of the, I don't know, like so much of my work as a writer is also really interested in touch and sentences, right? Like, how do we translate what we feel in our bodies, what is so physical, into a sentence? And so there's that moment, if where you are from corresponds to where you were born, here are my sentences. The speaker is uncertain of her ability to put into language or put into syntax what feels true. And I think that's ultimately also the project that we're all most interested in as language practitioners, because language is our medium, but it's a gesture. It always falls short.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about the touch of like sound in our ears and that's a physical thing, but mostly language is not very touch based.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it is really hard to like kind of make it embodied. I guess that's where singing comes into.
Yeah, absolutely. And music. Yeah.
Well, I feel like there's many more hours of conversation that we can have.
Yeah.
But this has been really great. Thanks so much, Tina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
It's great to be here.
Janann Alexander's book of poems is called Come From. It's available wherever you get your books. And that's the show. Interstates comes to you from WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana. We've got your quick moment of slow radio coming up. But first, the credits. Interstates is produced and edited by me, Alex Chambers. Our associate producer is Dom Hyab. Our master of social media is Jillian Blackburn. We get support from Eobon Binder, Luann Johnson, Sam Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, and Kate Young. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge. Our theme song is by Amy Olsner and Justin Fulmer. Additional music this week is from L. Boyd Carithers, whose album Doomtown is coming out soon, and on which album you might hear our poet, Janan Alexandra, playing the fiddle. All right, time for some found sound. That was Morning in the Neighborhood, Bloomington, Indiana. Until next week, I'm Alex Chambers. Thanks, as always, for listening.
Airplanes like stars slinging.